So, Final Girl is a term first coined by Carol J. Clover in her book Men, Women and Chainsaws, Gender in Modern Horror Film. It's this idea that she's the last one standing in your typical classic horror movie. She's your Laurie Strode in Halloween, Ellen Ripley in Aliens, or Alice Hardy in Friday the 13th. Young, pretty, virginal to the point of puritanical, avoiding excessive drink and drugs. And for being the good girl, she's quote unquote rewarded for getting to live. And so this idea is so seeped into the popular consciousness that we have movies like Scream, Cabin in the Woods, and The Final Girls that recognizes this trope and gets meta with it. And now it's extended off into fiction. We have books like Riley Sager's The Final Girls, Stephen Graham Jones' The Last Final Girl, lesser known works like Matt Serafini's Under the Blade, and now Grady Hendrix, The Final Girls Support Group. I have to admit, I was a little mad on his earlier book that we read for book club, which was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which was less about the blood-sucking undead and more about the patriarchy, gaslighting, and Republican values. But with the Final Girls Support Group, I mean, this thing is balls-to-the-wall fun. I can hardly blame Charlize Theron for snatching us up with the ink barely dry on the finished product. I think this was released this year in like June or July. It's going to be turned into an HBO Max series. Can't wait, because this thing is totally made for a TV adaptation. So we have our protagonist, Lynette Tarkington. She's a final girl, survivor of a Christmas Eve massacre that's left her some 20 years later, a paranoid, agoraphobe, sort of holes up in her heavily barricaded apartment with her houseplant as a pet. She rarely leaves her apartment at all, except to attend group. Group is group therapy, headed up by Dr. Carol Elliott, and a host of final girls. These are girls that have survived their own massacres, and after the killer has been caught or killed, and they've sold off the movie rights, maybe done a book tour or the talk show circuit. But the world has moved on since then, forgotten about them, moved on to the next shiny thing, but they're still left trying to deal with those terrors, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming, self-medicating, and trying to shape some sort of life for themselves. And these final girls in group are clearly modeled after some classic slasher flicks. Now you have Lynette, who's based on the lesser-known horror movie Silent Night, Deadly Night, but we also have Marilyn from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Danny from Halloween, Heather from Nightmare on Elm Street, Julia's Scream, and Adrian is clearly Friday the 13th. And this is just the first of many meta-horror Easter eggs that are sprinkled throughout the story. Okay, so here's a good one. Adrian Butler, whose death kicks off this particular story, is the lone survivor of the Camp Red Lake horror, which is clearly based on Camp Crystal Lake of Friday the 13th fame. Adrian Butler is named after the actress Adrienne King, who played Alice Hardy in the Friday the 13th movie. She was the final girl who was killed in the opening scenes of the sequel. Now, Adrienne King, who, by the way, reads the audiobook of the Final Girl Support Group, also had a cage installed at the doorway of her New York apartment. She was contending with a stalker that would leave threatening notes and Polaroid pictures of her from the day before on her doormat. And this would persist for a year and a half and would find Adrienne moving across the country. Her stalker found and followed her, and this would culminate with her stalker holding a gun to her head. Just wild, but back to Adrian in the story. With Adrian Butler's death, Lynette Tarkington's greatest fear has been realized. Someone has discovered the Final Girls Support Group and is determined to slowly kill them all off. She needs to warn the other women and try and figure out who the heck is responsible for these killings. Now, Lynette Tarkington, the paranoid agoraphobe from earlier, the person who rarely leaves her house, and when she does, tracks people's shoes, because stalkers can change their outfits but rarely change their shoes, has bug-out bags stashed all across town, never takes the elevator. I mean, she's lived such a tiny sequestered life that she's not really great on the empathy side, not awesome at picking up social cues, and her fears can come off as more than a little unhinged. I mean, as the story goes on, we find that she is guilty of a host of betrayals and screw-ups. So we get a horror thriller whodunit helmed by an unreliable narrator, which is just like literary catnip for me. I love this, and Grady plays a really fine line with this story. It's this conceit that all the familiar slasher movies we remember as a kid, and what it would be like if it seeped out into the real world. And that's interesting because it sometimes pulls you up short. You recall the squeamish fun of watching a Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, but then what would it be like if it was actually a crazed killer tearing a path of death and destruction in the real world, and how that would be understood in our current moment, because we'd have rabid superfans for this killer. We'd have people mooning over them. We'd have people bidding on the murderabilia, as it's called in the book, the bloody antlers that Lynette Tarkington hung from as she watched her family die. You would have police officers that would be more than willing to paint themselves as the hero in the particular narrative and go on the talk show circuit and recount how they saved the day, whether it was true or not, just using those deaths to their own advantage. And the victims themselves, the sort of blaming perhaps of themselves, casting doubt on their own motives. Perhaps they were the architect of all this death, that their bad decisions resulted in the death of so many others. I mean, this is all really heavy stuff. It's one thing to relish the mounting body count of your favorite slash movie. It's another thing to imagine this happening in real life. But then again, this is a horror book, so you're at this remove. Anyway, Grady Hendrix writes a propulsive story that just screams along to the final climax that I can't wait to see on screen. This thing was written to be adapted. Anyway, I love the final act of this particular book. It is smart slasher fiction that doesn't get too bogged down with the meta-analysis. A lot of fun. But like the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, the Final Girl support group is about a bunch of middle-aged women banding together, flaws and all. I mean, this isn't all sisterhood and sympathy. There's a lot of backbiting, bitching, and blaming besides. And Lynette Tarkington, she's not the pure-hearted, virginal young woman that typifies the Final Girl narrative. She's broken, flawed, and more than a little screwed up in the head. She's made some massive, almost inexcusable mistakes. She's alienated her only friends in the world and is a victim of her own bad decisions. But even so, even when all the chips are down and everyone is against her, she, like a true Final Girl, keeps moving forward. And I love that about this particular book. A fantastic read that I highly recommend, especially for the October Halloween season. All right, so that's it for me this week. A lot of reading set up for October. The Workbook Club is reading Agatha Christie, which I'm loving. This is something that I read a lot when I was a teen, a lot of Marples and Poirot mysteries, and it's like curling up in a warm blanket. It's just familiar, and yeah, I'm really enjoying the experience so far. The Discord Book Club is reading Amanda Montell's Cultish, which I loved. And of course, there is a ton of great new releases coming out. I read Richard Powers' Bewilderment, which I really did enjoy. I have a little problem with the boy on the spectrum that sees some truths in life, but I think Powers does a great job with that despite it. And I've started Anthony Doerr's Cloud Cuckoo Land, and just, it's a brick of a book. Really looking forward to it and just enjoying it so far. It's a real departure from his All the Light We Cannot See, which is also wonderful. Anyway, that is it for me this week. I hope you all have a great week of reading, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.